Good morning. I'm Stephanie Mandeville, Communications Director for NEA Rhode Island, and this is Ask Larry and Bob. And I am joined, as always, by Larry and Bob. Good morning, guys.
Morning.
Today is Tuesday, the 15th of February, as we try and mention every single time because things move so fast. I have a couple of things that I want to touch base with you guys on that popped up over the weekend. That one of them was Newsmakers, which is on Channel 12. Ted Neesey and Tim White had Commissioner Infante Green as their guest for the first half of the program. And I wanted to highlight the fact that we had an open question regarding the reopening plans from the beginning of the school year and whether or not districts were going to have to resubmit those to RIDE to get them approved with the mask mandate taken out. The commissioner did indicate that submissions of plans for approval is not necessary. And so she said that this is purely a local decision. And so Tim White did say, so this is really not so much a mask mandate lift as a mask mandate shift. Talk to me about your thoughts on that and how this is really just moving everything down right to the local level.
Well, it's a really important clarification because in the meetings we were involved with in the few weeks leading up to the decisions for the state to lift the mask mandate effective March 4th, so March 7th for the next day of school. We were under the belief that districts would have to resubmit their original reopening plans, which included mask mandates through the end of the year. So this is kind of a big deal that it is a shift, not a lift, but it's also kind of a big deal that the school committees can act unilaterally to lift the mask mandate. The commissioner, who is in charge of Providence, in conjunction with the Council on Elementary and Secondary Education, has already said, because of the low student vaccination rate in Providence, that masks would continue to be required. We had one school committee that voted before the mandate lifted that once the state shifted, they would not require masks. And I believe there were two school committees that voted just last night to lift it, but strongly encourage everyone to continue to wear masks. So do with that what you will. There was not an established metric. We do know that there are 3 communities in the state, all of which we proudly represent, that hit the student vaccination rates that would normally say it's time to consider lifting masking. That would be Barrington, East Greenwich, and Jamestown. But that was, just a metric they were using in Massachusetts. So if you applied that, there would be 3 eligible right away. And it's unfortunate this entire thing's been politicized. It should still follow our mantra of health and safety first, governed by science and medicine. So we'll watch over the next 3 weeks what each individual district decides to do and how they communicate it to the parents and students in those districts.
Yeah, I think the most disturbing thing is the politicization of all this because, as Bob pointed out, there are 3 districts that, if you use Massachusetts metrics, hit that vaccination number. But if you look at those 3 districts, they're all 3 of the wealthiest communities in Rhode Island. And then you look at the other end, and where the commissioner is going to continue mandating masks in Providence, I believe they have the lowest vaccination rate of students, both Providence and Central Falls. So again, as we always talk about the 2 Rhode Islands, but shifting it to a local decision in some cases is just going to be political, whoever's the loudest. There's a lot of things to be concerned about. Coming back from February vacation, one of the reasons we're happy the governor moved it to March 4th or March 7th. That gives us a week after February vacation. The second thing is, even in districts where you could lift the mask mandate because they've hit the metrics, you still have students that are coming in that are medically fragile, or special needs students, or students who are living with parents and grandparents who are medically fragile. So this is this is very difficult. It's not just okay, we'll do this for a few days or do this for a few days. This affects a lot of people. And even though you may think, okay, we've met the metrics and everything's fine, you still have people who are in danger or at risk, and districts have to be cognizant of that. And so turning it over to local districts without the metrics is a little disturbing. It would be nice for them anyway in making their decisions if they had those guidelines.
The other problem that we're still facing, despite it being so deep into the pandemic, is there are parents and some of our members who do not understand why masking was important and how it works. I had a parent leave me a message just the other day saying, well, the kids get to have their snacks with their masks off, therefore masks are meaningless. No, that's not how the math works. That is like saying you might as well not put on sunblock because it's going to wash off when you go swimming. You put on sunblock and you reapply sunblock so you don't get sunburned. If you're going to be out for 15 minutes and then remember to put it on, it's still better than not wearing it. If you're going to go into the tick-infested woods, you use DEET or something else to stop the ticks or the mosquitoes from biting you. Even if you forget for the first 15 minutes, the equivalent of snack time to do it, it's still going to be effective for all the rest of that time and decrease the probabilities. And that's just kind of a simple scientific mathematical principle that some of our folks and some folks out there simply do not understand. It's very frustrating and very sad.
I think that's why it's all the more important for the guidelines that are due to come out from the Department of Education and the Department of Health are very clear for districts to follow in the run up to March 4th. Do we know anything further about that yet? We haven't seen anything. Nothing's been released.
No.
I know that.
No.
Not yet. Not yet.
So
Stay
this
tuned.
Yeah, I know. So this interview with the commissioner, I thought was really good. It was covered a lot of ground, and I'll put the link for it in the notes below. She talked about masking concerns and how, yes, that's part of the things that she's concerned about, but it's social, emotional, and it's academic, and it's all of the pandemic as a whole that has really, really traumatized students. She talked about public school enrollment, and she talked about teacher vacancies. Bob, do you want to touch upon that? I know that's a topic of conversation for you this week in other venues.
I got invited tomorrow. I'll be on a panel with the commissioner and Victor Capion, deputy commissioner, before Leadership Rhode Island, talking about teacher recruitment and teacher vacancies. I went through Leadership Rhode Island 30 years ago, and it's probably the same talk I would have heard then that I could give part of tomorrow, magnified a little bit. I'm tempted to stand up and say, make salaries and working conditions more competitive with Massachusetts, and it'll be easier to attract and retain teachers. And that's true, and that's as good an opening statement as any. Pandemic has made everything worse, of course. In the old days, pre-pandemic, one of the things I would say that would surprise general audiences is that in the first 6 years of employment, we lose half of our starting teachers. So if you start teaching this year, it's 50-50 whether you're going to be with us at the beginning of year 7. Big out migration from the profession in the first 3 or 4 years, leading through that 6th year of slightly higher rates. And then from year 6 until retirement, we probably lose slightly over 1% of women teachers and somewhat under 1% of male teachers. And I'll flip over all the cards and tell you why. It's childbirth and the decision to stay home with children. There are other reasons, but the reasons for that discrepancy between men and women, and some it's a bad fit, some turn out not to be qualified to continue in the profession. Some decide to cast their lot in higher paying professions with different workloads. And some straight shot, they want to make more money, which folks with bachelor's and master's degrees can often do. We don't have good data yet about how the pandemic affected those numbers. Anecdotally, it's worse. Then you've got to add a cultural lens to it. And the simple takeaway I often give is talk to teachers and ask them if they would encourage their own children to follow them in the profession. Along my 30 years here at NEA, we once did commercials where we would show 2 or 3 generations of teachers, sometimes having taught in the same school. We do the father-daughter teacher team, or the mother-son, or the mother-daughter, or sometimes the grandmother, mother-daughter, all going into the profession. That is not often the case anymore. And some folks, some of our younger folks who do become teachers say it was despite, mom said don't do this, or dad said do something else, but I grew up seeing it and I wanted to try it. So there's a lot to unpack there. And
what's more important, recruitment or retention?
Well, they're really the 2 sides of the same coin, because if you can't retain them and you can't figure out why, then recruitment efforts fail, right? Now, we can do better with recruitment efforts by reminding folks it's a good and important profession. And there's where we're in an interesting dilemma, sitting right next to Massachusetts, which pays a lot more and has nominally better working conditions, both the obvious ones and the not obvious ones. Channel 12, which is doing yeoman's work on education reporting this week, just came out yesterday talking about the adult education rates in Massachusetts versus the rest of the country. Massachusetts is #1 and Rhode Island is 15th. And we've been talking for years about the 2 external predictors of a student's educational success being the mother's education level and the socioeconomic status of the parents. And poverty is not destiny, but those external predictors are important to recognize. So if you want to have a head start at the starting line with your public school students and you have a choice between Massachusetts and Rhode Island, pick Massachusetts. Is the unfortunate choice when you're competing with them, and you get paid more at the same time. You can't, and this will be tough for the Leadership Rhode Island class tomorrow, as it has been and way back when I talked to them, because there's this tendency to want higher performance, but to pay less for it. Mathematically, that does not work. The business folks in the audience get it. You have to pay for talent, so part of it is truly that. But if you figure out your retention issue, that means you figured out how to make the profession more attractive. And then you should also fix your recruitment issue on the other side. It's a systemic solution, not a one-off. I mean, if you can recruit all you want, but if you're losing even more than what we lose now in those first 6 years, you're missing part of the equation. So there, you don't have to go to Leadership Rhode Island tomorrow. You can just play that answer, and that's probably as much time on them as I'm going to get anyway.
I want to add two things to that. And quickly, if you ask teachers their first 5 years why they leave the profession, the #1 answer is lack of support. Lack of support by administrators, by the school community, etc. And that often happens in poorer communities because they don't have the resources. So, one of probably the only good thing that came out of Race to the Top was the mentoring program that started for teachers their first or second year. Of course, once we ran out of money, that program went away. But that was really beneficial for teachers to have support of other teachers, and it was on a regular basis. A lot of districts do that, but again, it depends on resources. The second thing about recruitment is I sit on a panel, commission actually, in the House of Representatives, the Rhode Island House, that's looking at recruitment of teachers of color. And the new Dean of Education at Rhode Island College did a great presentation about and it deals with students coming from poverty who want to go into teaching. And often those students, because they haven't had the opportunities, don't meet the SAT score to enter the education program initially at Rhode Island College, but they have a program where students can try it and they can take some in. Well, those students by their junior year in college have basically the same grade point average as students who were accepted into the program who met the initial qualifications. So part of it's a large part of it is just giving people the opportunity and reaching out to people and saying, you know, if you want to be a teacher or you want to go into this profession, here's the opportunity, here's what you need to do, providing the programs for them to succeed. And again, by the end of their junior year, they're in the same level as those who came into the program initially. So a lot of it's opportunity and support, and those two things. And Bob's right, I'm also a graduate of Leadership Rhode Island. And one of the components of Leadership Rhode Island is, you know, leaders in the community going in. And these are usually successful people. And sometimes it's hard to say, hey, there's some reasons why people aren't not successful because they lack the opportunities. So opportunity and support are the two major reasons, I think.
And one of the things you're going to confront when you're trying to recruit from communities of color is something that I remember having these discussions when I was a college student. It will be a shock to no one to know that I was not only a nerd, I was a student government nerd in college. So I would talk to friends about what do you want to do next?
I'm shocked, truly.
And we would, I know, right? And we would talk about
Breaking news.
we would
This is bigger than him retiring.
And we would talk about, you know, teaching as a potential pathway. And I seared in my brain, remember a friend of mine who happened, Black male, my age, equally involved in student government, who said, my parents would kill me if I became a teacher after I got this college degree. I have to go make money and give back to my community that way. And he became a lawyer. He's still a lawyer, a successful lawyer, just outside of DC. And that has stuck with me my entire life. It was like, oh yeah, you're putting expectations on folks who get the benefit of, you know, of a college education and say, wait a second, now, of course, we add the student debt lens to it. And that's one area that we can talk about. And you also have to talk about the change. We used to say that education for both K to 12 and higher education, you're not going to get rich, but you're going to get decent benefits and decent retirement security. We have not kept up the decent benefits and decent retirement security. It's so good, not as robust as it was, but we haven't done the offset on the salary side to make it competitive. One of the jokes I may tell tomorrow is, do you want your child learning math from the teacher who chose the lower paying, lower retirement job here or went across the border? You try and shock people into paying attention to the issue. And that's one of the lines I sometimes use to talk about it. Rhode Island as a state has to step up and realize that, you know, if we were, you know, sandwiched between Mississippi and Alabama, we would be recruiting folks from all over, you know, with our current, you know, wage level and demographic profile. But our border is surrounded by competitors who pay more. You know, Connecticut as well, but Mass is the one people usually use for comparisons.
You can add how people view or treat educators also. I mean, these many educators have bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, but aren't trusted or as professionals in their work. That stings. That has to sting after a while, and that's an issue to mix into the pot there, I think. Or just turn on the news right now and see anything that has to do with public education and how the professionals are being treated.
Yeah, the folks who have a political goal of destroying public education, of course, they're wrong, but they are also short-sighted because they are having a detrimental impact on all education.
Let's talk about that. WPRI, again, did a report on funding, school funding. And they highlighted a report from a Rutgers professor that shows high poverty public school districts receive fewer resources than wealthier districts. We hear and have a funding formula. Why doesn't the funding formula even the playing field across districts?
Well, the simplest answer is we still allow districts to put local resources well above the funding formula. So what, to the extent budgets reflect values, but eventually money becomes tight, I have always said the way we fund education in Rhode Island starves our urban core communities and makes more supportive, with better financial resources, suburban communities reluctant to do everything that should be done for our students. And the state, because we do not have a constitutional amendment that says every student in Rhode Island is entitled to a adequate public education. Adequate, it's not a big standard, right? That there's no judicial enforcement mechanism available to us as there is in Massachusetts, which has that constitutional amendment. And we support a constitutional amendment, as you'll be hearing about in the coming days, to further level that playing field. It's a problem. And what we're certainly not trying to do is to lower the bar from the communities that are stepping up to the extent they can. We're trying to raise it for the communities that are getting less and need more Even funding is not equitable funding. If you have a higher percentage of special needs students, if you have a higher percentage of students who are multi-language learners, if you have a higher percentage of students in poverty who are confronting those issues, we talked earlier in the show about the two external predictors of educational success. The reason socioeconomic status is on the charts is because you get to go home to a house that is more likely to have books and access to a computer and high-speed internet is the new measurement and everything else. And unless we're addressing those issues as well, we're not addressing the entire systemic problem that exists. And that's the honest conversation about funding public education. We are behind where we should be. In every community, somewhat behind, and in our urban core communities really behind. Now, we don't represent those communities in Rhode Island at NEA Rhode Island from a organizing collective bargaining standpoint, but we feel that we represent all students in Rhode Island, which is why we talk about those issues, because they're really important.
The rising tide.
Rising tide. And recruiting new teachers.
Right.
And also, students who live in poverty going to schools in communities that are poorer than the wealthy communities don't have the resources. They need more resources. And the other thing that, if you take a wealthy community, I'll take East Greenwich. Yes, there are students who live in poverty in East Greenwich, but it's a small percentage compared to Providence. And we have to make sure those students have the resources they need. But not only can the community afford additional resources onto what the state provides, parents can provide those resources too. So if you're living in a wealthy community and you're a wealthy person and you have a child that needs extra help in reading or extra help in math or, as mental health issues that need to be addressed, they can afford to go beyond what the school provides and provide for their child. If you're living in poverty, you can't do that. So that just exasperates the problem. It's kind of what I tell people when they say, well, when my child was in school. No, when your child was in school, you could take care of the problems that are arisen. You could throw money at the problem, and there's nothing wrong with throwing money at that problem. But there are a lot of parents in a lot of communities that can't afford to do that. So there's so much that goes into this just besides, well, let's make sure the funding formula is equal for everyone. When you make it equal for everyone, you're going to make there can be differences. And Bob just pointed out the urban areas, and yes, we don't represent them, but we're here to educate all kids. So it's
Imagine that you had to fight to make sure there were school breakfast and lunch programs in place for students who could not afford school breakfast and lunch. Imagine that in the last couple of years, we had to fight to make sure that a student who couldn't pay didn't get stuck with the cheese sandwich or the sun butter sandwich, because we don't do peanut butter anymore. And the account was brought up. And you know, I think it was in Warwick, not one of our districts, where a private donor brought all the accounts up to par so the kids could have a hot lunch again.
That donor had to fight to do that too. They weren't going to let her do it. Yeah.
Right. What does that say about us that we're fighting that? And in my community, I live in East Greenwich now, parents can talk about granular curriculum changes that benefit a particular amount of kids. And in a community up the street, we're talking about trying to get everybody fed. So yeah, Rhode Island has.
And you want to improve test scores and academic achievement. Well, kids have to come to school healthy. They have to be fed. They have to be rested. So providing breakfast and lunch. And when all the money that's spent on education and all the money the government spends, that is a really low cost to help all students out. It's a no-brainer, but like you said, we had to, fight tooth and nail to get it done.
It sounds like the fight will continue also for the funding formula issue.
The funding formula, the funding overall, and continuing to educate the public about how budgets reflect values and if they really value. And there are all sorts of ways to talk about it. You can talk about it for economic development. Businesses want to come to a state where the workforce is educated. You can talk about it as just straight civics and government, that we want an educated population so that we don't have to explain the math behind masking.
I should highlight too that in that Channel 12 piece, Ryan Pearson, who's a senator from Cumberland, heads up the task force for that funding formula, worked tirelessly to do it. And of course, put a report out in January of 2020 that basically mirrored what this Rutgers professor also put out. And then of course, the pandemic hit and things kind of got, derailed, backburnered, whatever you want to call it. So.
And it really has been, reflecting back, we were starting on the right path in the late 1980s, and then the banking crisis hit. And we never got fully back on track in providing adequate state support for local public education. And, part of it will actually provide property tax relief, but it means that it's going to go up on the other side. You're going to have to raise revenues either in sales or income tax or anything else. There's no magical solution that costs less than we're spending now if you want to be competitive. It's just not the, and they'll criticize us and say, well, that's just the teachers union saying it. No, it's just a rational analysis of the situation. If you want to compete with people who are better positioned at the starting line and spending a lot more money, guess what? You have to step up. You have to step up and do what's right by our kids. So
it's priorities, showing your priorities, budget, proving values. That's really what it comes down to. Larry, there are a couple of pieces of legislation, I think, being heard this week. One is the Let Rhode Island Vote, which I will put the link in the notes as well. That's up, I think, for hearing tonight. And then there's something this week on school construction, I think.
At a school construction Thursday night in the House, it would be to put on for the election this fall a bond issue for $300 million. Remember, 3 years ago, we passed a $250 million bond issue for school construction. And that goes to just what we're talking about. Think of the message that's sent to kids when they go into buildings where there's no heat, the ceiling's caving in, there's mold, there's mildew. Businesses wouldn't send their employees into those buildings to work. We should not be sending students. So one of the good things that came out of the bond issue was it passed overwhelmingly. It's, I think, impacted something like 180 schools, new construction for 180 schools. The $300 million that's being proposed would add to that. It helped with 28,000 new jobs and kept people working on the building trades, all good, high-paying jobs. And the other thing is that these bonds would, in the new buildings, would all be designed to be environmentally and climate friendly, and there'd actually be bonuses for doing things that help with that. So you give new buildings and new learning sites for students. They can be East Providence High School. If you haven't been there, what a beautiful, up-to-date building that's just technologically amazing what they can do there and the opportunities they can provide students. Every student should have that. So we'll do that. Provides great jobs. And again, the better we educate students in the long term, if you're thinking long term, better educated students, better paying jobs, pay taxes that help all of us, stay here in the community. I mean, it's just really, people may not think, oh, school construction isn't a top education issue. Yes, it is, because we have students in buildings that are 50, 60, 70 years old, and it just, the technologies from the 1950s and 60s, not 2022.
It's another issue we've been talking about for 30 years. I wish we had done a 500 million bond 2 years ago when we did the 250, because the interest rates were lower then. But we have to keep, deferred maintenance. We found out during the pandemic how much deferred maintenance was impacting us. We did not have the electrical grid in place in a lot of buildings to plug in the air purifiers without blowing out a fuse, literally probably a fuse in some places instead of a circuit breaker. And some of the air filtration had never been changed. And that's kind of at the lower level. And every time there's a leak, you cause structural problems that cost a lot more than staying on top of replacing roofs on a timely basis. So, and that money, we support 300 million, if you didn't glean that from the conversation, and that money gets leveraged. Local districts put money in as well. Hopefully there'll be some federal money available for some of the side projects, the carbon neutral buildings, the bringing them while you're doing the work, solar power, geothermal, anything you can do for both short term and long term energy savings and efficiency that pays back not only economically over time, it pays back environmentally over time. So there's a lot of, we're all kind of getting it all at once, and we have to just make sure we keep the pressure on.
Before we wrap up, I do want to say congratulations to the Bristol Warren teachers who ratified their contract after a couple of years, I think. So that was good news to read that this morning. I'm happy for them. Congratulations to BWEA.
A good message to all of you still in negotiations, especially with expired contracts. Part of the pep talk I give when I talk to members in those situations, that in my long experience here, 100% of contracts have eventually settled. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel yet again, and it's,
You gotta hang in there. Yes.
And they hung in for a long time, but
They did.
the local leadership over there, the two local presidents, just did a terrific job. All the negotiating team and working with the new superintendent, Anna Riley, to get that done. So congratulations to all of them. And they do a great job over there. And it's been a long, difficult last couple of years.
Yeah, it was a long haul.
Yep.
shift our attention to Westerly to try and get their collective bargaining agreement in place. They are unsettled in the fight right now, and more negotiations coming up in the coming year. So the battle goes on in a lot of different places.
Yeah, hope for the same path for them. I also want to say good luck to the PC Friars for tonight. It's a big game.
Big game.
And big game, yes, against Villanova. So that's it.
The price is through the roof. You could
Basketball? You're talking about basketball?
you could fund public
College
education.
hoops, baby.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that.
You can fund public education by scalping your PC tickets for this evening.
Yeah, they've done Cooley's done an amazing job there. Just
Yes,
kudos to him.
absolutely.
Let's hope he doesn't get recruited away for more money.
Yeah.
Kind
That
of
hasn't,
thematic,
worked out real well for a few of them. They got recruited.
but,
All right. Well, good luck to PC tonight. Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank
As
you.
always.
Thank you.